everyone. This is Diane Rasmussen McAdie with UK Column News. I'm really happy to be here for part 3 of our interview series with Professor Gloria Moss. We'll put links to part 1 and 2 in the write-up for this interview. So part 1 was Gloria and I talking about the horrible things that have happened to the university system here in the UK. And part 2 was an interesting discussion between Gloria and Ben Rubin about what has been happening in Gloria's research career, looking at the differences between men and women. And part 3, I will say in advance that this is going to be a very serious discussion, but we do hope to end with some lightness and some things that we can all do to fight the darkness that is present in what we're going to call the trans agenda. So Gloria, welcome back once again to UK Column. Thanks for joining me again today. So I'm really happy to expose this amazing amount of information that you have found and looking forward to getting into it. So where would you like to start today?
Well, we're going to talk about the transhumanist agenda today. And I think it's worth going back in time, really, and saying that this is based on the presumption that humans are not perfect. And that goes back a very long way, actually, that presumption. So I think it's useful to sketch in the background before we move up to the current day and the transhumanist agenda that's playing out before our eyes now. So if we go back in time, of course, in the book of Revelations 13:18, we find the statement that the man has the mark of the beast, 666. That's not a positive way of looking at man. And well, it's rather interesting that in modern day terms, the carbon atom that man is substantially made up from, man being a carbon-based life form, is made up of 6 protons, 6 electrons, and 6 neutrons. There we have it, 666. And so mark of the beast in Revelations, carbon, of course, is the target of many global institutions, organizations, governments, vilified. And here we are made up substantially of carbon. Around the same time, more or less, as Revelations appeared, we find the secret gospel of John, about the 2nd century AD, I think, which gives us a very good account of Gnostic thinking. And I do think that understanding Gnostic ideas is really enlightening in looking at the transhumanist agenda and providing a context, if you like, for the transhumanist agenda. So very briefly, the Gnostics, they posited that there was a light source that created everything, including 10 aeons, who created kindness, which created the first perfect, remember that, the first perfect human being. And this light source then created 4 illuminaries, who in turn created the 12 eternal dimensions. One of these eternal dimensions has the name Sophia. And the story goes that Sophia became unbalanced and was expelled because of the unbalance into a dark dimension, becoming paranoid, egotistical, and aggressive. And the demiurge, as it's known, that was in charge of Sophia, then forced Sophia, this is one of the 12 eternal dimensions, into a low energy, dark creation, which is the material universe. This is the first time we hear of the material universe that created humans, the material, and that also created, according to Gnostic belief, a hierarchy of controlling rulers, dark forces known as archons, Archons. And what the demiurge and the archons then proceeded to do was to attempt to create a slave worker, a different version of the human created, the perfect human created by the light source. And well, the higher dimensional force, we're told, stepped in to mitigate the harm by imbuing these slave workers with thinking and spiritual power. Sounds good, doesn't it? But the archons, think of them as dark forces, they retaliated by using diverse means to control and suppress these slave workers. And the kind of tools they used were the imposition of false religious beliefs, the eradication of higher knowledge in all subjects. That's something that we talked about, Diane, when we were talking about universities and
Yes.
to some extent what's happening with schools,
Yes.
mindless entertainment, and genetic manipulation. These were the tools of the archons, the dark forces, to control the slave workers that had been modified in a good way by the light source. And so here we have Gnostic thinking, which I think provides a useful backdrop when we look at the transhumanist agenda. And just to complete the picture, according to this vision of the Gnostics, 1/3, sorry, not as much as that, 1% of the human population, think of it as a continuum. At one end, 1% of the human population are aligned with the light multiverse. That's extremely positive. And those people have an innate sense of right and wrong and are creative, are light workers. At the other end of the continuum, 1%, are those who, on birth, receive a fixed counterfeit spirit, is the term used. So we have light workers at one end, counterfeit spirit at the end, balanced. Gnostics put it at 1%. Now, these counterfeit spirits suffer from paranoia, total service to self, and are non-creative and psychopathic. Not a very pleasant combination. So vibrationally speaking, these are very much opposites. Well, you might be asking, what's in the middle? Well, according to Martin Colburn, who's spoken at several of my conferences, I've run questioning history and questioning science conferences, he had a bit of a download and was told that the people in the middle are dubbed empty vessels. And according to Martin Colburn, they have no innate spiritual orientation, no innate sense of right or wrong. They remain materially orientated, but they can be moved in either direction, depending on how powerful the 1% at either end are. Currently, the counterfeit controllers and perhaps the majority of these empty vessels are veering towards that dark end. But they have the capacity, those people in the middle, the 98%, to absorb the light or the dark of the groups around them. And so we can perhaps try and do what we can to, without sounding arrogant, really, do the work of the light source and try and move people gently in the direction of the 1% light source. Keep that in the background when we come on to talk about transhumanism, or the trans and the transhumanism. Meanwhile, I'd just like to add two other things. This comes from my research journeys of several decades, really. And the first is from my work, which I talked about with you, Diane, on gender and design, how a person's sex, biological sex, influences the visual, graphic creations that they produce, having an enormous impact both on the themes and also the style of what's produced, and also on people's preferences. This is what we were saying, that in many studies I've conducted, the conclusion was that quite unconsciously, males preferred designs created by males, while females preferred designs created by females. So we have the very weird situation where most purchases are made by an army of female shoppers, 83% of all purchases, and yet most design is in the hands of men who will tend to prefer male type design. It really doesn't make sense at all. This all needs to be changed. But as part of that research, I discovered a very rich vein of research done over the course of the 20th century and a bit beyond, comparing the drawings and paintings created by children and young adults. Just to give you a flavour very quickly, because we haven't got time for anything more today, but an early study in London by researcher Ballard, this was 1912, an enormous sample he gathered, 20,000 drawings, can you imagine, from children aged 6 to 10 years of age. And what Ballard found was that more than 20% of the boys' drawings showed ships as compared to only 9% of the girls. And in 1924, a short while later, over in the US, another researcher, McCarthy, with an even bigger sample, this was 31,000 drawings of children aged just 4 to 8. What she found was that the boys showed a vast preference compared to girls for drawing vehicles and tools. So if you take the male propensity as 100%, the girls' propensity to draw vehicles was only 22%. So there was a vast disparity in what she found in the drawings of these very young children, 4 to 8. And then moving on in time, 1977, a study by Hargreaves, this was up in Durham, not far, I think, from where you're living currently, Diane, found again a comparison of the drawings of girls and boys aged 10, a significant difference in the propensity to draw the mechanical, with, guess what, the boys showing a significantly greater propensity to draw the mechanical than the girls. Well, maybe you'll see in a little bit when we get onto the trans and transhumanist why I'm drawing attention to the male propensity for the mechanical as against, I haven't talked about this, but the female propensity to draw human life and life in all its forms, including plants. That comes out very strongly from these studies. And then after the going got rather difficult, to say the least, continuing with this research on sex and design, I moved on to study of leadership because my background is in human resources. I'm a fellow of the CIPD, the main organization for organizational psychology, and conducted a study into best practice leadership, which is in this book, Inclusive Leadership, published by Routledge. And what you can discover on the literature of leadership is very, very interesting where the subject of sex is concerned. Sex, I mean biological sex at this point. It's not a salacious book in that way.
Oh, that's a bit disappointing.
Before you get too excited about this book. But essentially, it's been found by several researchers that men, by and large, have a very strong preference for exercising a style of leadership called transactional leadership. And that's the style they like to have exercised over themselves as well. And this, if you want to have a picture of transactional, I was going to say what George Orwell said, think of a boot coming down on your face. But no, let's be more serious. In terms of the competences, they include monitoring followers' performance and correcting mistakes. It's a very hands-off approach until things go wrong. you had an interesting comment about this, Diane, in terms of how it may have influenced the university system. This emphasis in transactional leadership on
Yeah.
monitoring followers' performance
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
correcting mistakes.
Yeah. I noticed it increasingly through my university career, where everything was transactional, and education and research aren't necessarily always transactional. By then, I meant things like learning objectives for students. And I've heard other people discuss this recently about you're setting objectives for the students, saying this is what they will learn by the end of a course or the end of a module, that these are the things that they will learn. They might learn something totally different, which is wonderful. Whatever they learn is what they learn. It's also the same with how performance is measured of academics now, where you have to bring in a certain amount of money per year. That increases based on your rank. It has to be a certain type of money. But of course, by the time I left, it was all about getting money from the UK research councils and only doing research that supported the development of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But that's a different issue. The pass rate of students, so that you could have a wonderful group of students and everyone passes. You could have a horrible group of students and everyone fails, but you had to have a certain pass rate, which is like, 67% or whatever it is the target was that they set for you. So basically, you're creating transactions about absolutely everything, as well as the type of research in my field that was meant to be the best was only anything that was statistical. Never mind the fact that a lot of people using statistics didn't know how to use them appropriately, and they would use the wrong test, which basically using the things the wrong way. But as long as they had statistics there, it was still okay, because that was more valuable than the type of qualitative research that I used to do, which was actually interviewing and engaging with people to find out how they worked with information and what kinds of communications that they preferred. That was, again, to me, because I created rapport with the people that I worked with and learned more from them than I ever would have learned from doing a statistical test with them. That was, I guess you could say, a more female approach because of the relational and the engagement aspect. But that was considered to not have been as useful as, well, okay, but what percent of people said this, or when you ran a t-test, what happened, or whatever the issue was. So I was seeing it as well, that sort of the more, I guess from what you're saying, sort of the more female approach potentially to research and teaching was not as valued as highly as it should have been. And we all have important things to add, but not apparently not anymore in this sort of university model that we're now facing,
It's
unfortunately.
really interesting that you talk about a series of transactions, because that's very much part of how a transactional leader would view the task of leadership or management. Not in human terms, but as a series of transactions. Um, and the finding that males and females have very different preferences, both in how they are led and how they lead themselves, has come out of many people's work. First of all, there was a Rosner in the States, followed by Eagley 2023, and then in Britain over here, Beverly Alimo Metcalf did some fabulous work. She was based up at Leeds University, showing the differences in, by and large, male and female preferences. So think of the male preference in leadership terms as transactional, as a desire to impose, as you say, Diane, objectives to control the territory. Control, I think, is very much a governing principle of transactional, rather than, as you say, just letting students learn whatever they choose to learn. So control is the name of the game, I think. Now, skipping several centuries on from the Gnostics and the Book of Revelations, we'll now chart, I think, the movement, the progressive movement that has got us to where we are today in terms of the transhumanist agenda. And some people would say that transhumanism represents the Masonic aim of assisting humanity in evolving to merge with a cosmic consciousness, with a similar idea, as we'll see, emerging from the Fabian Society. And we ask ourselves, is this work, this transhumanist journey is this continuing the work of the archons that we mentioned as part of the Gnostic description of the framework in which humans find themselves? Is the true transhumanist agenda continuing the work of the archons? You be the judge. So let's begin by charting the journey. I've put Mary Shelley's Frankenstein at the beginning because I didn't think we could really talk about transhumanism without a consideration of that. And we all know the story of how Frankenstein creates a monster. Well, it doesn't create a monster, creates a being out of dead parts of people in cemeteries. And then this rather unsightly individual becomes rejected by society and so develops monstrous psychological characteristics. Now, apparently this book was written while Mary Shelley was in Switzerland in the company not only of Shelley, who became her husband, but also Lord Byron. And they took it in turns to write ghost stories because the weather was bad and they were cooped up and thought that would be a good thing to do. And Lord Byron's father was a Freemason. And could it be that her novel was a critique of the merger of the human with this wider consciousness? Who knows? But certainly you wouldn't come away from reading Frankenstein thinking that the creation of a mechanical, part human creature was something to emulate. I don't think.
No.
Yeah. Well, next we come to H.G. Wells, author of The Time Machine, and the 1940 book New World Order, a non-fiction work which outlines plans for a socialist one-world government. That book includes the Human Rights Declaration, which served as the basis for the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I wrote an article on the Fabian Society for UK Column.
Excellent,
maybe it's
by the
about
way.
a month ago.
It was excellent. Thank you again for it.
Oh, well, no, thank you, Diane. And he was a member of the Fabian Society. And so this doesn't have a good feeling to when you've read the article and found out about some of the agendas of that the Fabian Society have, which includes the eugenics agenda and a pseudo-communist agenda and a New World Order agenda. You might say, well, this isn't again something terribly desirable. But he also wrote perhaps less known book, 1896. That was The Island of Dr. Moreau, Moreau. And that's about a mad scientist creating human-animal hybrids. So is that a template for some of the thinking that's going on today? And you talked to me a bit about that before we came on air, Diane.
Yeah,
this
there's
idea of the animal-human hybrid.
Yeah, and they're starting it very early in childhood. So for people that know my coverage and my work around trying to protect children from all of this, there are, for example, picture books. One is called A Boy Who Wanted to Be a Deer, for example. It's a picture book, obviously meant for very young children, who starts out with a boy saying, "Oh, I would be so much happier if I were a deer." And then his family and everyone says, "Oh, that's so wonderful. You can be whatever you want to be." And then I think by the end of the book, he's wearing antlers that he's placed on his head or something like that. And he's so much happier, and his family is so happy that he has found out who he really is. And so we see this and there's a lot of other examples of this as well. There was also reports of, I believe it might have been last year in 2024, maybe before that, of reports in Scotland of someone allowing a child to identify as a cat, bringing litter trays into schools And there was one who was identifying as a wolf, I believe, somewhere in the Highlands. I'll try to find some links and I'll put them in the write-up for this interview, just so that people see that I'm not making this up, that this is actually the parents and the schools being so brainwashed by the state that they're pushing this agenda onto children, thinking that they're doing the right thing for them, when obviously the rest of us can see the kind of harm it's going to do to them when they grow up believing that they can actually become an animal and that that's okay. And we're supposed to go along with this delusion. It's absolutely despicable.
So there was H.G. Wells writing The Island of Dr. Moreau. That was 1896, about a scientist creating human-animal hybrids. Moving on, then we meet Aldous Huxley, a fellow member of the Fabian Society, along with his brother Julian Huxley. And it's thought that in his work, for example, Brave New World, 1932, and with George Orwell, who has been described also as a member of the Fabian Society, he was taught by Aldous Huxley at Eton. It's thought that what both of these men were doing was merely fictionalizing the globalist transhumanist plans of their fellow Fabians. And they're very different, these two books, obviously, the Brave New World and 1984 of George Orwell. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit when we look at a lecture that Aldous Huxley gave in 1962 in Berkeley, where he picks up on that. But just sort of remember that for the time being. So, if you like, these are forays into the world of mixing the human with something non-human, interfering with human biology in one way or another. Brave New World does this in a very obvious way by talking about breeding centres that have been set up. There is no normal reproduction between males and females. No longer happens in Brave New World. It's all done in laboratory conditions.
Yes, is it called the director of hatcheries or something like that who's in charge of it? Yeah.
That's it, yes. And so that 1932, Brave New World. On my chronology, I put next Simone de Beauvoir and her work, The Second Sex, which was published in 1949. And here we're moving into a study of what it is to be a human through a different lens, I would suggest. In that book, Simone de Beauvoir wrote, "One is not born, but becomes a woman." Sociologists might interpret that as meaning that femininity is a construct, a social construct. But it's a strange statement, to say the least, because every one of the 70 trillion cells with a nucleus in the human body is stamped either XX or XY. So let me just say that phrase again. One is not born, but becomes a woman. A biologist or anybody with a sane mind, I would say, could not possibly buy into that statement. One is born a female from a biological standpoint. And I did suggest when we were talking about design, and I showed it, I think, talked about a photo that I'd seen of Simone de Beauvoir with her partner Jean-Paul Sartre, that she towered over him. And I just asked the question whether Simone de Beauvoir was actually born female, because if that were not the case, then this sentence would take on a whole new meaning. One is not born, but becomes a woman. Maybe we have here a statement about somebody becoming a trans woman.
I would, yeah, I would beg to differ for any of these people who are now trying to become women or saying that they are women, and whether or not they've ever lived through a monthly period. Because that's definitely something that I think crosses into belief. And I just wanted to mention these. I just thought of these, Gloria, the Protect and Teach conference that you and I both spoke at with Kathy Mudge and her group earlier this year. This lady was passing out some stones with writing on them, and she makes a lot of these so that people can leave them around at bus stops or wherever. And just a couple I wanted to share with the audience. One here says, "Trans ideology is a belief; it is not fact." And that's what I think. That's what an ideology is, right? It's belief. And this one is "Stop gender affirming butchery." So I'm afraid that what we're about to cover with the transhumanism elements, we're not just butchering, reproductive organs, but we're also looking at butchering the essence of what it is to be a human, and where this leads to. So it's very dark, but we have to look at what they're doing. So,
and we're looking at the chronology and the history, if you like, of that's led us to where we are today with the transhumanist agenda. Important to note, I think, that Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre were both part of the Front de Libération des Pédophiles, acronym FLIP, F-L-I-P. Very disturbing back then, and many pillars of the French community, likewise, were supporters of FLIP, were in favor of reducing the age of consent of children. The next landmark I've noted down here, certainly where gender is concerned, we'll come back to the transhuman in a minute, is 1957, with the work of Dr. John Money, who has pushed the trans ideology in a very big way. He stated that biology does not matter in relation to gender, and that people are born gender neutral, his phrase, not my phrase, which defies biology. Interesting to note that he was a public supporter of paedophilia and incest. He was apparently a deviant child abuser. And so he has that in common, if you like, the support of paedophilia with Simone de Beauvoir, who was a leading exponent of the notion that we are not the sum of our biology. And then, just to log this on the timeline, in 1950, we're back to the transhumanist here. And I do think the trans agenda feeds into the transhumanist because it provides the origin for the idea that the human body, as gifted, if you like, by the light source, it provides the idea that that can be interfered with. It's legitimate in some way to interfere with that. In 1950, Julian Huxley, another member of the Fabian Society, coined the term transhumanist in his book, New Bottles for New Wine. Let's just pick up a little bit on the trans agenda before we move on and focus exclusively on the transhumanist. And when I was at the conference with you, Diane, I talked about how about the attempt to deny the biological basis of sex. Yes. And as part of that, I mentioned the work of Martine Rothblatt, used to be Martin, but now Martine, who in 1995 wrote the book, The Apartheid of Sex. So I'm just going to read a couple of sentences, that's all, from this book by Martine Rothblatt. It's stated there that the genitals don't determine your sex and that you can choose whichever gender you want. There is a gender fluidity that crosses the entire continuum from male to female. The book talks about separate male and female genders as a constructed fiction. Maybe you should be showing those stones again. What do you
Yes.
think?
Trans ideology is a belief, it is not fact. And stop gender affirming butchery. That's, it's interesting because this whole idea of gender being on a spectrum is one of the things that I lost my academic career over, speaking out against this ideology and what it was doing to people. And I guess there's different models, but I think the most common one, I think it's 72 genders that exist. There's more, I haven't checked in a few months, but the idea that all of these things are different genders, and it's, I feel it's they call it being progressive, but I personally, I don't know what you think, find it regressive, because um, it's making a lot of assumptions, I think, that if you don't fit into certain boxes, then then you need to be trans. And I think that's one of the things that's happening to children, that obviously I grew up to be a woman in every way possible, but when I was younger I had interest in science. So even though I wasn't maybe a boy in other ways, which I obviously wasn't, my interests were in science and space and computers, but I still obviously have the all of the feminine characteristics. So I think it's one of those things where if you believe, and I never believed I was a boy and I never felt masculine, I just had different interests. But it goes back to what Dr. Jenny Cunningham has said, and I've interviewed here previously on UK Column, where she says that this idea of gender dysphoria that we're feeding into children, that you need to maybe change your gender because of this or that, because you feel like a boy, or you felt like you're born in the wrong body, is actually something to do with the state of our brains. Whether it's a result of, some people believe it has to do with autistic traits, some people believe it has to do with other mental health conditions. But she said it's the only thing in the NHS where they are using something that is affecting through your brain and responding to it by the physical process of giving you hormones, or as we get more and more intense about it, removing body parts and adding new ones, which again actually is rather transactional, isn't it? That if you just decide that you're going to remove your breasts, and what they do is they rip skin off your arm to create a male body part and attach it to you, that you are now a man. That is actually, I just thought of that, is actually rather transactional, isn't it?
It's very true, and it's a focus on the mechanical. Whereas,
Yes.
in fact, I talked about this in our last interview. Differences across all five senses are strongly manifested. And Professor Geary wrote a whole book on that, cognitive sex differences, looking at their manifestation across all five senses. Changing boobs or other body parts isn't going to change any of that.
No.
As I said, the visual, which is the area I focused on for over 20 years, psychologists are saying that men's eyes are spaced on average 5 millimeters further apart than females, giving them better stereoscopic vision. Well, that may have been well adapted to hunting. Females' fourth color pigment, allegedly there in 50% of women, may have been an adaptive mechanism for berry picking. Hunter-gathering is what we were doing apparently for 99% of human history. But you're not going to change any of that by removing boobs or other body parts.
Yeah.
Those differences will remain. But going back to Martine Rothblatt, if I may, for a minute, didn't stop at that book. Went on to write another one in 2011, termed Transgender to Transhuman. And this is where we see the way that trans can be a stepping stone to the transhuman. And in fact, we can read explicitly in this book the following statements. Here's a quote. In transcending biology, technology offers an explosion of sexual identities and human identities. leading to transhumanism and hybrid human-computer species. So you can see how the trans can be a stepping stone, well, quite explicitly, according to Martine Rothblatt, to the transhuman. And just to echo what you were saying, it is anomalous that mental health is dealt with through physical interventions in the way that you described, whereas normally mental health is not dealt with in that way. Today we see reference to gender affirming care. That's the phrase that's used. And it's thought that by 2032, that this will be worth, it's a big industry, this, it will have a value of $1.9 billion.
1.9
Let's
billion.
hope that that projection doesn't come to pass. And certainly there's a massive rise in the numbers of people who are experiencing what used to be called gender identity disorder in the DSM. That's the Bible of mental health conditions, and is now referred to as gender dysphoria. The numbers have skyrocketed from figures from the London Tavistock's Gender Identity Disorder Service back in 2009-10, 77 patients, to the figure for 2021 to 2022. You might, those listening, want to hazard a guess as to what that has increased to, the 77. It's increased to 3,585, which is an explosion, increased by over 4,000% in that period of more or less 10 years. So something's happening here. Something's perhaps being pushed, being given the imprimatum of, how can we put it down, it's being normalized.
Oh, absolutely it is. And you know, on the political side of this, with the Supreme Court ruling that we had earlier this year about the reality of biological sex, what I have seen happening just anecdotally, just watching the news and watching social media and watching the people who are supporting this, is that it's actually made them a bit stronger about supporting transgenderism and changing genders, and because they're very angry at all of the sides, you know, which is, and it's interesting considering that Keir Starmer is our prime minister when this all happened, that they're even angry at Keir Starmer, the Fabian, who is a Fabian, and all of these other, you know, I think you were the one who pointed out that half of our cabinet currently are Fabians potentially, and that are, you know, around half of all of the Labour MPs are somehow associated with the Fabians. But this still happened in the Supreme Court, which, you know, you have to wonder, why is it that obviously the people that really believe in it, or are told they have to believe in it because of their BlackRock ESG scores in their companies or whatever it is that is making them do this, or in the schools, but they're still even, I think, pushing down on this even harder to make it a reality, even though the country has now, the Supreme Court has now ruled, no, this is not a thing, but they're making it even more of a thing now. So it's actually had, I think, backlash rather than relief for those of us on this side of it who see how evil it is.
I think there are signs of change. The you know, NHS is changing some of its practices now, but it's slow.
Yeah.
Anyway, continuing the timeline, because we want to get up to the present day, I suppose. I'd put Aldous Huxley's talk, lecture that he gave at Berkeley in 1962 on this timeline myself. Well worth listening or reading the transcript of the talk he gave, which he termed the ultimate revolution. And aka a blueprint to enslave the masses. And what he describes here is how we can improve on previous revolutions which used violence and shift in the environment as the main modus operandi. We can improve on that by focusing our attention not on the environment around the individual, but on the individual themselves. And that's basically the theme of the lecture that Aldous Huxley, another member of the Fabian Society, gave in 1962. Just reading directly from what he said, we can contemplate, he said, the ultimate final revolution when man can act directly on the mind-body of fellow man. And so this is what he sketches, and it's extraordinary, really, what he states here.
I'll be sure to put the full text of that talk in the write-up for this interview so people can read the full thing.
Just to give you a few pointers, he states that scientific dictatorships of the future will be closer to the pattern of Brave New World than 1984 by George Orwell, because it is more efficient, he says. You're likely to have a much more lasting and controlled society than in the Orwell-type society, because he's talking about taking over the minds of human beings rather than their environments, and getting people to enjoy their slavery rather than impose the slavery on people through violence.
You will own nothing and be happy.
Yes, shades of that, I think, definitely in this lecture of Aldous Huxley. So he writes, dictators will become more interested in the type of techniques employed in Brave New World, and this will be the ultimate revolution, scientific dictatorship. So he talks about how do you induce consent? How do you get people to love their servitude? And I've just noted down three aspects that he refers to. First is very interesting, Pavlovian conditioning, which we all know about, Pavlov and the dog. He says that the power of conditioning is enhanced by states of psychological or physical distress or fatigue. Psychological distress, I think we had a lot of that in the years 2020 to 2024, which might have enhanced the Pavlovian conditioning. He talks about the way Hitler organized a lot of the rallies at night when people were more tired, so that the conditioning had a greater effect. So that's the first point. The second point he signposts is suggestion and hypnosis. And of course, in the book that I wrote with Catherine Armitage on critical thinking, I added a section on the television after I realized the power that it has to put people into hypnotic states. So actually the television is an immensely powerful tool of suggestion and hypnosis. But what Aldous Huxley states about hypnosis is fascinating, I think. He talks about the fact that 20% of the population are easily suggestible, and by contrast, another 20% of the population cannot be easily hypnotized, cannot be hypnotized with ease. So you have these polar opposites, the suggestible and those who are not suggestible. Could that mirror in some ways the continuum that the Gnostics presented us with? Do you remember that?
Yes.
The light workers at one end, 1%, and then the dark forces at the other, represented in the same numbers. Perhaps that's what we're seeing in these 20% that Aldous Huxley is talking about. And he suggests that we can actually categorize humans according to their suggestibility. And maybe what the Gnostics said wasn't really wrong at all, that we should think in terms of a continuum of counter spirits at one end and light forces at the other. And the third thing he talks about is electrodes. Already when he was writing in 1962, UCLA was conducting experiments with rats that had electrodes implanted into the pleasure centers of their brains. It's quite funny, actually, at this point, because he said that the rats were so delighted by the effects of the electrodes that they could press on a bar 18,000 times a day. But should a day go by when the possibility of pressing on the bar elapsed, then the day following, the rats would press 36,000 days to deliver the pleasure to those centers of the brain in which the electrodes were placed.
Sounds like the rats had an addiction problem.
But that he was talking about this in 1962, about how best to control the human race. Is this rather transactional, this whole emphasis on controlling humans rather than, as you said earlier, Diane, allowing people to learn in whichever way they'd like?
Well, and we saw this as well. Brian Garish covered this so well in 2020, and on the Mindspace document, the behavioral insights team, the SPI-B team, all of these agencies that were working in the background on behalf of the government to figure out the best ways to control us in 2020 and 2021. And that's all easily findable online. It's all there. All of the plans that they had for the nudge unit, the behavioral changes, and then the media campaign that followed. And I've presented on this before. I presented on this on the Common Knowledge Edinburgh talk that I did at the Scottish People's COVID Inquiry, showing exactly how this was done based on examples from the media as well as examples from these policy documents. It's all very much out there. So this was all planned much earlier. I think we're seeing before 2020.
And the name of the game is control
Yes.
of human beings, rather than their ability to flourish in an environment that affords them freedom. Well, the next thing I have on my chronology is the establishment of the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, MIRI, in 2005. And leading lights, if you can call them that, in MIRI included Ray Kurzweil, head of engineering at Google, and one of the modern prophets of transhumanism. He believes that we are partly organic tissue and partly, well, can become partly mechanical parts. He foresees, would like to see a merger of biology and technology. Also on the advisory board of MIRI is Dr. Nick Bostrom, Swede, who's a philosopher at Oxford University, who's written about personality pills and super intelligent machines. And would you want this on your CV? He's co-founded the World Transhumanist Association.
Oh. I wonder if that got him promoted.
I don't think I'd want that on mine, but anyway. And
No.
Also connected with MIRI is PayPal co-founder Peter Thiel. That's Thiel.
Oh yes, we know him well.
He's also CEO of data analytics firm Palantir Technologies. And they have lots of government contracts, that company. In June last year only, he was asked in an interview, this is Peter Thiel, whether he thought the human race should survive. And after a long pause, he replied, yes, but. So that MIRI was established in 2005. 10 years later, we have another book popping up. That's by Yuval Harari, who is a professor and closely associated with the WEF. His book has the striking title, Homo Deus, Man as God, A Brief History of Tomorrow. And essentially what he describes in this book, which you can access freely online, is how Homo sapiens has survived starvation, plagues, wars, and now the next stage beckons, he says. I'll just read you his words without the accent that goes with it. Having reduced mortality from starvation, disease, and violence, we will now aim to overcome old age and even death itself. Having saved people from abject misery, we will now aim to make them positively happy. Again, shades of you will own nothing and be happy. And having raised humanity above the beastly level of survival struggles, we will now aim to upgrade humans into gods and turn Homo sapiens into Homo Deus, i.e., divinity. He adds that it will be necessary to change our biochemistry and re-engineer our bodies and minds. A small price to pay for the great project of the 21st century to ensure global happiness, which involves re-engineering Homo sapiens so that it can enjoy everlasting pleasure. Death, just a technical problem that can be overcome. So what can we say? In seeking bliss and immortality, he's in fact trying to upgrade Homo sapiens into gods. Well, what's to say we're not gods already? And I'll come to that at the end. What's to say we're not already gods? What's to say that we don't already have divine qualities, that the control in society has I'm trying to think of the right verb, has diminished, has substantially diminished, has not allowed to flower. And he talks about the three paths to the upgrading, as if we're computer systems of humans: biological engineering, cyborg engineering, and the engineering of non-organic beings. So you can read about that in his book. We'll talk about, right at the end, we'll have a discussion about, is he missing the point here? Are we not already divine beings that don't need any of this upgrading? We just need to have the control pedal relaxed. This is what I would say anyway. And I would also say that I think many of his assumptions on which he builds his case are completely wrong. Just to make 3 points. He suggests that famines and plagues, which beleaguered humans over centuries, were all natural. But what's to say that these were not all engineered events, as you might say of current day plagues and pandemics? He suggests that Homo sapiens is part of an evolutionary process, but a lot of voices are debunking evolution. He suggests that human health could be improved by re-engineering humans. But what about improving human health by not disallowing certain treatment protocols and by reforming mainstream medicine? He doesn't consider any of those aspects to the presumptions that he makes. So I would say it's a very misguided text, but it's an important one to be aware of if we're trying to understand the transhuman agenda. Sorry, I think you wanted to say something, Diane.
No. That's I was just thinking that if I don't know if you have any more to go past this, because it sounds like we're getting pretty close to the present day. So I'm wondering, just watching the time, if we could maybe talk a little bit about, where do we go from here?
We're coming very close to the present day. On my timeline, I've included Klaus Schwab's book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, 2017. That's just 2 years after Harari's. He talks about the fusion of biological systems with technical systems to create a whole new world. Then we've got Elon Musk, Neuralink. It's very similar ideas there. In 2018, we can upload a link to the provost of Ghent University, Petra de Suter, who you might describe as a trans person, describing Aldous Huxley's book Brave New World as visionary. That's basically the theme of a TED talk that Petra de Suter gave in 2018, how technological reproduction could replace what is described as old-fashioned reproduction.
So we go back to the director of Hatcheries, Brave New World, and then we go into the current day where, if you are a couple of the same sex, then there's technology available to make you a child, and you don't even have to have a man and a woman together.
This is the theme. This is the theme of the TED talk by Provost of Ghent University, Petra de Suter. Even talks about the world of technological reproduction, in which 3 or 4 people could create a child. Extraordinary. And we're coming very close to the present day. I just want to signpost the fact that the Wellcome Trust, which is the UK's largest provider of non-governmental funding for scientific research, they're also a publisher of books. And 2 books published, which you might not be aware of, which I discovered by accident one day when I was having coffee in the Wellcome Trust Centre in the Euston Road in London, and there was a table stacked with books, and I took a look. Here are 2 of the titles on that table. 2021, After the Storm, Postnatal Depression and the Utter Weirdness of New Motherhood by Emma Unsworth. This book, I went back the next day to take a close look at these books. This book refers to the, quotes, alienation, desperation, and exhaustion after birth.
Well,
some people would say it's a joyous time after birth. I mean, I had a cesarean after I gave birth to my son. It was painful, but I was, very, very joyous time. Then another book on this pile was published 2023, just 2 years back. The title, Eve, the Disobedient Future of Birth. Yep, you heard that right. Eve, the Disobedient Future of Birth by Claire Horn. They obviously liked this book at the Wellcome Trust Centre because it was on the doors in the women's toilets. Just to give you a very quick sense of this book, Chapter 6, entitled The Tyranny of Biology. The real tyranny is our inability, she says, to relinquish archaic ideas of sex and gender. She says that the view that there are only 2 sexes is so entrenched. Well, it's biologically correct. And on page 179 states that the idea that artificial wombs could be used to address gendered inequity in reproductive labor is compelling. So this chimes with the rector's belief that Brave New World is visionary, that we need to move to a world of technical reproduction, and rather than old-fashioned.
The Handmaid's Tale as well, right? Where you have the handmaids stepping in as, I don't know if you know the Handmaid's Tale. You have the handmaids stepping in because the wealthy wives that were married to the commanding husbands were mostly, because of what had happened in the world, were infertile. So these handmaids, who were the women identified as still being able to have children, were literal stand-in surrogates for the wives. and then they gave the baby up once they gave birth to the child.
So there's a genre of books, it seems.
Yes, absolutely there
this
is.
line that nature, or the light source, hasn't done a good enough job.
Right.
Well,
so let's move on to that a bit.
Before we get to the positive, just only, if I could, just last year, a prime mover and shaker in the world of artificial intelligence, Sir Geoffrey Hinton, British-born, British educated, went over to Canada, I believe, received the Nobel Prize last year for physics. And in his acceptance speech last year, he spoke of the need for forceful attention from governments and international organizations towards research on how to prevent these new beings from wanting to take control, which takes us back to Frankenstein, which is exactly what happens to the being created by Frankenstein that takes control. And in fact, Hinton, not only did he speak out last year, but in 2023, he resigned from Google, citing concerns about the risks of AI technology, including the potential for advanced AI systems to develop goals that are not aligned with human values. So he's a courageous man, and a man who's prepared to put his life work to one side. How many people can we think of who are like that? And well, we've asked the question, is this counter-natural, what we're seeing? This whole transhumanist agenda? Is it something we can associate with the work of the archons who want to interfere with the rather wonderful creation of the light source, according to the Gnostics? Is this transhumanist agenda that's being played out with a lot of money behind it? Is it a continuation of the archons' work and an attack on the work of the light source? Shall I just end with some rather interesting thoughts from Alex Collier in America, and then maybe we've still got time to discuss this. Alex Collier, many of you might know his work. If not, you can find it on the internet. He claims to be an Andromedan contactee, and over many decades, I should add. And in one of the interviews, this is what you'll hear him say. So I'm quoting his thoughts here. Natural humans are a race, he says, that is genetic royalty. And he says that on the basis of presuming that human DNA has links with 21 star systems and is made up from genetic material from 22 different races. And he says that this genetic makeup, what he calls genetic royalty, gives humans higher dimensional souls that give them access to not just the third dimension that many of us live in, but the fourth, the fifth, the ninth, the 11th. And while this may sound the stuff of fancy, I've heard him talk also about Project Blue Brain, which is based in Switzerland, and which has actually found parts of the brain that can link to all these other dimensions. And in linking to these dimensions, this is what Alex Collier says, our thoughts transmit to all those dimensions across the universe. Absolutely extraordinary stuff. And this leads Alex Collier to state that there is actually no limit to what natural humans can accomplish. There are no bounds. There are no limits to what we can accomplish, whether spiritually or genetically, because of our makeup. And he goes on to say, once you capture a soul in a mind matrix, the soul is captured everywhere in all dimensions. And so conceivably, this transhumanist agenda in capturing human souls will also be having an effect across all dimensions in the universe. Um, and um, and so what's happening now is potentially extremely, extremely serious, not just for life on Earth, but on life forms across the universe. He goes on to say that the universe is always going through resets, and that a natural reset is coming in 2030, and that the dark forces want to stop this by imposing their own reset, which could be the transhumanist agenda to
Could also
destroy the
be
human.
could also be the Agenda 2030 that we all know about.
Exactly. And so I
Interesting.
suppose the message from Alex Collier is that we are already royal, if you can use that term. We're genetic royalty. We don't need to be tampered with. We just need to have, well, this would be my opinion anyway, we just need to have the foot taken off the control pedal.
Very interesting. And I guess that's a positive way to end what has been a very a very distressing conversation, but also very necessary. This is very important information to get out to the world. I guess to add from my perspective, again, once again, it is not UK Column's policy as an organization to condone or support or prescribe any sort of medical treatment or healing treatment to anyone. But I will say on a personal note that I'm a Reiki master teacher and I've been on this path for several years. And one of the things that goes along with what Brian Gerrish talks about all the time is that we are in a spiritual war. And Brian doesn't necessarily name them the way you have just done with the background research that you've done, but that there is definitely a light and a dark, and that to win this battle that we're in, and we can call it whatever we want to, that ultimately it is light and dark, and we have to have the light to face the dark. And I would say that in my work as a light worker, which is what a Reiki practitioner is, or I'm a teacher as well, that we can channel that energy, we bring it down to where it is needed. And I have seen myself firsthand positive effects in a range of ways in my practice over the years. And whether or not you want to believe in this, whether or not you want to see it somewhere else or call it something else, maybe some people call it, they're following Christianity, following Jesus as a light worker, whatever it is that we believe, that there is definitely something out there that when we look at this and what can we do to fight it, well, what we have to do is in whatever way, and I say this all the time to the audience, whatever way that we find that is the most effective for us as individuals. You don't have to become a Reiki master teacher to fight it. You can just maybe have a laugh a little bit more, remember to connect with people, have a good time, find joy, go out in nature, look at the trees, go to the beach. Whatever it is that brings you joy and happiness and makes you smile is one of the best things that we can all do individually. And it's one of the most pleasurable and happiest ways that we can do it. And we all know that the people on the other side of this hate laughter and happiness. And I am sometimes criticized for trying to bring laughter onto UK Column. That some people like it. Some people think they just want to hear the hardcore news, but the only way that we can fight this is through light and laughter and joy and love and connection and all of those human elements that they are trying to take away from us by trying to make us into computers or whatever it is that they're trying to do. So I just want to say to the audience today, with this distressing information, what can you do? Go out, enjoy yourselves, be happy, give someone a hug, whatever it is that brings light into the world is going to be the way that we can all fight back to fight this. So thank you again, Gloria, for your time. I always ask at the end of every interview, is there anything else that you want to add that we haven't discussed already?
I would like to add that actually leadership and the quality of leadership that we have, both in organizations, in governments, and in our personal lives, the way we treat other people, that can be completely transformative. And it's what I found through the research I did, mention it again, inclusive leadership, that when you have the opposite of transactional leadership, which is transformational in combination with servant leadership, you create a world, you create a powerhouse of productivity, zest for life, motivation, and mental well-being. And some of the competencies that play out in that are empathy. So if we can use that in our day-to-day lives, in the interactions we have, that will make an enormous difference. Listening to people, listening in an active sense, acting on what you hear, giving people confidence, taking an interest in other people. These are just some of the competencies in this miraculous form of leadership that a few wonderful organizations are already using it. If we have this instead of the rather toxic, transactional top-down leadership, then we can bring a new world into being relatively easily.
Thank you very much for that, Gloria. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time today, and I know we've gone on a bit longer, but this is so important. I think it was good that we had this in-depth conversation. Everything that we've referred to today in this conversation, plus probably some additional resources, will be available in the write-up that I will do following this interview, which you can find on ukcolumn.org if you are listening to this on another place such as YouTube or Spotify or wherever you catch our interviews. Again, thank you, Gloria, for your time. These 3 parts to this interview series that we've done with me and you and Ben Rubin have been fantastic. I want to thank you again for all of your hard research and your time and your written contributions to UK Column as well. So to the audience, thank you for your patience, for your time listening to all of this today. I hope it inspires you to do something. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. And I truly mean that. And by doing so, you will fight the evil forces that are coming after us. So thank you again, Gloria.
Thank you.